Welcome to the Just Womanist series, sponsored by the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. My name is Melanie C. Jones, and I teach ethics and theology here at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia, as well as direct the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. The Just Womanist series features scholars, practitioners, activists, who are living into the womanist adage, doing the work our souls must have. Today, I've invited Khristi Lauren Adams to talk a little bit about her journey to becoming a youth advocate and an author. Khristi is the author of The Parable of the Brown Girl. The book highlights the cultural and spiritual truths that emerge from the lives of young Black girls. She is currently the Firestone Endowment Chaplain and an instructor of religious studies and philosophy at the Hill School in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. She is the founder and director of the Becoming Conference, an annual conference designed to empower, educate, and inspire girls between the ages of 13 through 18. Welcome, Khristi.
Thank you.
So tell me a little bit about your journey to becoming a youth advocate.
Yeah, well, I always say that I am a product of the people that have poured into me. So I think, I can trace it back to my first job, but the more I think about that, I think it goes back to the first time I had someone mentor me or the first time somebody took a chance on me. And that really started in the Black church. My pastor at the time was very much into youth development, community development, and spiritual development, but particularly emphasizing youth. And so as a result, all of the resources of our church, the majority of them, were poured into the youth ministry. And we weren't a big church at the time. We were fairly small, and so it was just me and a few of my friends and my brother, and so as a result, I think we got a little bit more attention. And then as time went on, the youth ministry grew. But I've had great youth pastors and mentors, and I've just been really blessed. I was thinking about it on the plane ride over here. I was just thinking about that question and thinking about, I really think that God's love for me, I can see it extended through the people that God placed in my life to pour into me. And so when I got to college, I felt like I need to be pouring back too. I need to be doing something too. So whether that was teaching GED program for AmeriCorps or serving with Big Brother, Big Sister, I always felt like I needed to be doing something more than just taking classes or singing in the gospel choir, And so I think the whole youth advocacy journey started when I was a kid and I was poured into, and then later on that seed, just continued to grow in me and just in this desire to pour into other people. But I do say in the book, in my intro, I always sort of trace it back to working at a residential treatment facility in Portsmouth, Virginia, and working on a unit for girls with severe emotional difficulties. And, I got that job just because I was looking for jobs after college, and, I couldn't find one, and I realized that later on, in retrospect, there was like a lot of turnover for this particular job, and so they were just hiring. And so I was blessed actually just to be able to be there for about 6 to 8 months. I worked there, but my life was changed, on that unit working with those girls, and they were more than just bad kids. I came in, and part of the training was, a lot of narrative around their negative behavior, not really talking a lot about, where they come from, their roots, and why, why they were there or why they behaved the way that they did. But they were all Black girls, and there was about 10 of them on the unit. And just the relationships that I built when I was there was just so profound. And it was there that I realized, like, this is my calling. Once I read their charts and realized that, they'd been burned with cigarettes, when they were kids, beaten with baseball bats, sexual assault, all sorts of things that those young Black girls had to endure. And then they wound up in this sort of facility that was one step from juvie, It was there that I was like, okay, I feel like this is what I'm supposed to do. I didn't know what the route was going to be, exactly, but I just felt like I know I'm supposed to be pouring into young people's life, and it's not just because I'm a young person, right? I was 21 at the time. It was essentially just because I felt like that was what I was called to do.
Much of your work features Black girls, and yes, you're a youth advocate, but I feel as if you've centered on particularly the experiences and perspectives of Black girls. Why Black girls?
Yeah, number one, because I was a Black girl, right, and essentially am a Black girl. But I don't want to just sort of narrow it down to that. But I do think that that's a lot of it, you know. But I do remember growing up, and you know, I had a great upbringing, and you know, both my parents were very loving, and like I said, I grew up in a community, a church community, a very strong church community. But still went through the things that Black girls go through in society. You know, I really felt overlooked. You know, I struggled with, you know, I wrote about it in the book, struggled with my body image issues. Hair was a big thing. You know, it wasn't, I mean, I just saw in the news, you know, all of the, you know, Miss Universe and all the representation that young Black girls are able to get today. I don't feel like I had then, you know. There was no Michelle Obama to look to. I had, you know, there was some. Oprah Winfrey was, you know, huge at the time, growing up in the 90s, but, you know, it wasn't this big, you know, natural hair movement, you know. So all of those things that, or at least the majority that Black girls go through, I struggled, you know, felt like I was too dark, or I was, you know, the only Black girl in a white school and pitted up against the other girls. And, you know, it was just this sort of constant. Once I grew up and sort of went through my own journey with that and evolving in those different areas, you know, the more Black girls that I meet, you know, they express the very same things, right? It doesn't matter where I am, whether I am, you know, worked at a university in Los Angeles County, right? So whether I'm in LA or I worked at Georgetown for a while, whether I'm, you know, was a youth specialist at a community development corporation in Somerset, New Jersey, it didn't matter where I went. Black girls were sort of experiencing the same struggles and the same joys, right? And that consistency really, every space that I was in, it didn't matter what my job title is or was. I felt like it was sort of my responsibility to do for them what I felt like I didn't necessarily have, right? So even though I say I had like great mentors, I feel like I had great spiritual mentors and personal mentors, but I think, you know, as a young Black woman, I struggled a lot in silence. And I wasn't able to really articulate a lot of those issues that I had out loud, right? So when I see those things, when I'm in those spaces, I can identify them very easily, and I feel very drawn to them. I think it really starts there, right? It doesn't matter what space I'm in. There is a calling that I feel very pulled in that direction to create safe spaces, or to, you know, just counsel one-on-one, be a listening ear, build relationships. And so I really think that's what it comes down to. Hopefully I answered the question, right?
Yeah, I think your interest in not only targeting in terms of being a kind of care specialist or working with advocate for Black girls, but also gathering towards solutions to some of the ills is also important for me. I'm thinking a little bit about your Becoming conference. So tell me about that work.
Yeah, so Becoming started before Michelle Obama's book, Becoming. It feels so bitter every time I say that. It comes off that way. But it does, because it was before the book. And so anyway, so after, or before the book, so, but the point I'm trying to make is that after the book, people were like, oh, like Michelle Obama's book? And I was like, no. But yes, it's an honor to be sort of associated with that. But it started a few years ago. I left Georgetown University. I was working there for a little while and went back home and was helping out at my church as an associate minister there, and was working at a place called the Christian Wellness Center, which is a counseling center not far from where my church was. And I was working as a pastoral counselor because I'm not licensed, not a licensed clinician or anything like that. And so they felt like, I know the head, her name is Vanita Welcome. She's a close friend of my mother's, and I've known her my whole life. And she's like, hey, I know you work with girls, and, you know, would love to have you come in as a pastoral counselor. And I was like, sure. So I came in sort of on a part-time basis, and it really wasn't, I wasn't marketed to work with girls. I think that she sort of knew that girls may sort of be drawn in my direction, or parents may be drawn to bring their daughters, but for the most part, it was just teenagers in general, but then it was just young girls, anywhere between 9 and 18. And the more I would counsel, and I wrote about a lot of them in the book, but the more I would counsel, the more I would go back to Miss Welcome and be like, I really feel like all these girls feel like that they're struggling in like isolation, right? From day to day, I don't know. Sometimes I'm counseling a girl and I think it's the other girl because they literally are going through the same things. And I remember saying it'd be so great to get them all in one room. We need to do a one-day something with them. And it started off as this sort of one-day Saturday workshops that we were going to do, and then it sort of morphed into becoming conference. And so what I really wanted in the beginning was to center Black and brown girls specifically. I've been to a lot of conferences that were for girls in general, and there's usually, a little diversity here and there as far as like panelists or speakers, but, there's like one thrown in or another one thrown in, and I'm like, I want to create a safe space, and I kind of keep using that same phrase, but it's really important, but a safe space for these girls where they will feel like they're centered, their issues are at the center. Everybody can come, but they're the ones that are being represented. They're the ones whose, issues and challenges and, like I said, joys or whatever it is, successes, that those are the things that we are addressing first and foremost. So that was really, really important. And another thing that was important that I learned in youth ministry growing up is that this sort of model that Pastor Story, my pastor growing up, he always was like, kids lead kids, and at the time I wasn't sure if it was just because I wasn't sure if we had the resources, and so it was like, let's just throw kids in youth leadership. But now I look back and I'm like, no, kids need to hear from themselves. And actually one of the things I wrote about in the book is that there was one girl who sort of was painted as angry and going through a lot. But one of the things that she sort of uses when I ask her, who was it or what was it that made you sort of change? And she said, oh, my older cousin, she sat me down and said, girl, you need to get yourself together. Older cousin was like 14, 15, and the girl was maybe like 12, 13. So it wasn't me, you know what I mean? It wasn't, a teacher or a parent. It was her 15-year-old cousin who sat her down. And that was when she was like, okay, I get it, So I had, built relationships with girls in the community from my church and elsewhere. And so there were about like 10 girls that I was working with or chose to work with for the Becoming Conference, and said, hey, I need you all to help me plan. And so we were meeting, monthly and coming up with different things and, what do you want to talk about? What do we want to address? And a big thing for me, the first conference, both conferences that we've had so far, was to make sure that those girls that were planning were leading there too, hosting, planning workshops, of course with our guidance. And that nobody that spoke was over 25, and I actually preferred to be younger than that. So I might have gotten up and closed out, but for the most part, they were leading. So it was the first conference we had at Rutgers, it was a good sort of trial by error, trying to figure it out. And we had the next one at Princeton Theological Seminary, and we partnered with the Center for Black Church Studies, and we had a sort of youth focus that year, and so we did one there, and that wound up going really, really well. Very similar, even more so that year, was just more girls up front, more girls performing, dancing, rapping, whatever. And then another thing too, I learned from the first conference was not to over-program for kids. They just wanted to chill. I mean, during lunch, to see them in the seminary, like on the quad, most of them had never been to Princeton. A lot of the girls were from Newark or Trenton, Central Jersey, didn't even know anything about seminary, but they were eating lunch and we had like music playing, a playlist outside, and they were just out in the grass, just wanted to be with each other. There were times I played YouTube videos, they just wanted to dance. They just want to chill. Like, I didn't need to be like speaking down to them all the time and telling them what they don't need to be doing, or having some adult in the room pointing the finger. I mean, that was essentially the first time when I watched that I realized, like, oh, safe space. That it's literally just creating it for them and stepping back. Mm-hmm. That's what safe space means. Mm-hmm. I realized that. So then last year, a close friend of mine passed away, and then I started working at the Hill, so we didn't have it last year. So now we're looking at having it again this year, but I will likely do a retreat because the girls love sleepovers. They love, you know, when I'm like, oh, let's figure out who's gonna speak and what's gonna be the topic, they're like, who cares? You know, like they just wanna hang out. And so I was like, okay, I'm gonna take the girls to IHOP next week because I'm on break, so I can finally do it. And we're gonna talk about how we can find some retreat house and maybe take 30 to 50 girls, 50 would be a lot, to do maybe some sort of 2-day retreat, and just have them go and be, you know, I don't have to fly in some grand speaker, you know, I think we can figure out something there. So that's the Becoming Conference / retreat.
So the book, Parable of the Brown Girl, coming out in February 2020, published by Fortress Press. I'm just intrigued first by that title, Parable of the Brown Girl, and just what was your inspiration to get to this, writing this text?
Yeah, well, the title, my best friend, Ashley, shout out Ashley, because I have to say, Ashley came up with the parable part. And the reason why I say that is because I was talking to her, and, you know, you just be on the phone with your friend, like, I got this idea. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, but I'm trying to figure out what I'm trying to say. And so I was like, am I trying to say Beatitudes? And I don't want to say Gospels, because not. And I'm like, Jesus is like teaching, saying like, I'm somewhere, come on, you know. And she was like, parables? And I was like, yeah, okay. So that was really how that happened. And because I had always sort of wondered when I read these stories of Jesus's encounters with the woman at the well, or you know, any of the marginalized of society that Jesus encounters. I always wondered, you know, if I was reading the gospel text, what would it be titled? If one of these girls that I've had these encounters with met Jesus, you know, and what would that be called? And so I always just thought it would be called Parable of the Brown Girl. Something with brown girl, because, and I mentioned in here like more about aesthetic. I sort of went back and forth between black girl and brown girl. I was open to either one, you know, but this sort of stuck with me because I felt like it was always, you know, the gospel was always so sort of descriptive, you know. So that was where that came from. But it really started with my counseling at the Christian Wellness Center. Even though I use girls from, stories from girls from my career overall, but it was those one-on-ones that I would have where it would be just like the two of us and no one else was in the room, and they're just telling me about their life, you know. There's no audience, they're not performing, they're not pretentious, they're just wise beyond their years, and nobody is trying to hear them or see them, you know what I mean? Like, so I, you know, started counseling like I'm the counselor, and then as time went on was like, oh, I'm learning a lot, like I'm changing, you know. I would leave those sessions and drive home and just be like full, you know, and I would feel so grateful and think, you know, wow, well, how come nobody else is getting this? Like, is nobody else is going to hear this or experience this with this 9-year-old girl, you know, figuring out how to navigate her struggles. And so many of us, the society that we live in now is just so performance driven, you know, everything's for the gram, and none of this was that. And yet it was still so authentic and profound. And that was really where it started, and that seed was planted. But I never thought about writing a book about it. A publishing company contacted me and said, hey, we've seen your tweets and some of your writing, and we would love for you to write for us. And I was like, I don't know what to write about. And we brainstormed a bit, and I remember my pastor used to say, you know, you write about what you know. And I was like, I don't know nothing. Like, I remember when he said that, I don't know anything. But it stuck with me. And now I was like, oh, I know Black girls. I know how to be one. I know Black girls, not the expert of all experts, but I just felt like that was where I was. And and then I had that conversation, with Ashley. And so everything started coming together, and I put together the proposal, and the acquisitions editor that had contacted me was like, oh, this is great, took it back to her team, and they were like, no. They rejected it. So she got back to me and said, they just want you to like maybe go back and redo it and maybe, have it fit all girls. And I was like, So I thought about it for like 2 seconds, right? And then was like, no, you're proving my point. Like, this proves my point. And she was equally as upset. Like, she was just like, I just think it's a great idea. And I feel like they're missing out. And she actually now works for Fortress. Funny. But anyway, I was like, wow, this sort of all girls matter thing. Like, when I was trying to say, no, Black girls matter. And that was enough for me to be able to say, no, this was like the drive, it goes back to that calling or that soul sort of comment that we'll talk about later. That was when I really, something was like ignited in me, and I was like, okay, no, I have something here that I can do something with it. I'm not going to just push to the side. And I contacted 2 other publishing companies. Fortress was one, because I was like, I have the proposal. They both got back to me favorably, and I just wound up going with Fortress, and that's how it all happened. So I will always mention the story of being rejected by the first company, because I can't say that I would have done this had that not happened. So I'm grateful, for the no's that sort of led to the yes.
So I read the book, and one of the things that I love about the work that you do with the book is you have a way of taking these kind of really deep issues, such as body image and notions of Black girls as fast, such as kind of transnational conversations in terms of how do we look towards a kind of thinking about Black girls in terms of African American girls, but also continental African girls who live in America, right? So just a really fascinating way. And one of the things that I think I like about the book is your kind of theological integration that happens with these popular issues. Particularly, my favorite section is the Imago Dei section. Tell us a little bit about that section.
So that particular section, and honestly, the Imago Dei, image of God, for those of you that don't know, is something that could have been in every single section, right? Like, that's, I think, after every chapter, I try to focus on some sort of theological or spiritual truth. And not everyone fits with every girl, but Imago Dei fits with every girl in this book and outside of the book, as far as sort of needing to come back to the issue at hand, is that the girls have not really heard the narrative or heard it or embraced or really received the message that they are made in the image of God, that they are the image of God, literally, quite literally walking the earth, So it could have been in any section, but I did choose it for the one that was a little bit more focused on aesthetic, on one particular girl who, continues even to this day, struggles with her skin complexion, her hair, her weight, to the extent that it morphed into, as you read, like, eating disorders and cutting and just some of the more serious issues. But toward the end of the chapter, what I try to do is just try to create or paint a holistic perspective of Black girls, in the sense of you are the image of God, right? And what if I had heard that message more than once, right, as a young girl? What if this particular girl, Leah, in that chapter, from jump, she went to a Christian school, growing up, and where did we miss that mark, in the church particularly, when it comes to black women and girls, And so that's one of the things that I try to point out to each girl. I try to do practically just every day, in my relationships with these girls. But particularly in the book, I talk about how essential it is for us to make sure that we are, let me go back, because the messaging that Black girls receive is always the opposite, right? Mm. Your hair is not good enough, your skin is not this enough, your weight is not this, you're not enough. And that's why people are making such a big deal over the Miss Americas and the Miss Universes and, all the representation. People are like, oh, why is it such a big deal? It's a big deal because historically in this society, in this culture, everything about Black girls and what they represent is always is perceived in this sort of negative light, and that's what they get from a young age. That's what they get. Why am I so ugly? Why am I so this? Why can't I be this? So it's so essential for that image of God message to start, and just to sort of we got to like bang it over their heads, consistently. And I think a lot of times when we talk about the Imago Dei, it's like everybody is created in the image of God. We are all the Imago Dei, and we are. But it's important to name that Black girls are the Imago Dei, right? It's important to not lump them in the bunch, because there is no other issue. I mean, there are, with I guess other cultures, a majority culture, right? And I'm not trying to be exclusive, but what I am trying to do is be specific and intentional. And it's important that they don't hear, hey, you're one of the, no, you are the image of God, and at the end of that chapter, I think Leah, had said something like, I think God's got to be a Black woman or something, like she sort of evolves in her own sort of sense. I guess wrestling with her image and all of that, but I'm going back, she says that because she's like, all the suffering that she has gone through, she automatically sort of associates that, and that's how she sort of embraces that God could be like her because of the suffering, which I would say could be seen as problematic if that's like the only thing in and of itself, right? Mm-hmm. As opposed to God is like her because of how beautiful and inside and outside, and her wisdom and who she is, externally and internally. So I think it sort of maybe has to be both and.
So I've talked about my favorite part of the book, but I'm interested and curious about what was that moment writing the book that was kind of that aha, this is where I'm sure, both of the points kind of come together in terms of your own background, but also what you intend for the work to become.
I think when I got to chapter 6, I mean, the whole process was, it was all enlightening. I think I was evolving in general, but chapter 6 is the parable of the angry brown girl. And I think toward the end of that, an angry Black woman, an angry Black girl, that is the stereotype that I feel like, I don't know, it's the one I've heard the most consistently my whole life. And so being able to deal with that in this book, and this one particular girl that I had been working with, it was the aha for me, because it was like hitting home. It was the practical that was sort of like now, like with the theological and the culture, like all that, the intellectual, it was all sort of like coming together. There's a part where I talk about how God sort of makes room for her anger and sits with her in her anger. And it's not that I was coming up with like a remedy, but it was more like, as I was writing, I was like, I was learning too, right, about sort of how to approach this sensitive topic for me of attitude, Black girl, angry, and I'm like, wow, God is angry for us. God is angry for her. And for me, God was angry for me, or whatever it is that I experienced, as opposed to wanting to like fix my anger or fix me, that's like essentially the Emmanuel God with us, right? And I talk about like that Who Will Cry for the Little Boy from, what's that movie? Antoine Fisher. Mm-hmm. Great poem, but I think about who will be angry for the little girl, for the Black girl. And so this particular girl recently well, part of her, I sort of mix her story with another person, but she was running for school office, and she had sort of changed her life around or whatever in the last, like, over the summer. And so, you know, I'd heard from her parents that her school, the administration, I'm being discreet now, was not going to allow her to run. After she declares running, she's now, you know, like getting great grades, changed her attitude, you know. This is the one whose like cousin told her, you know. And so they decide, you know, based off of your behavior last year, you know, she can't run, you know. And so her dad was upset, and he posts about it, and I saw it, and I was, I mean, livid, like so angry. I called the principal, like, you name it, you know, because I'm like, here's an opportunity, right? Not, oh, here's my time to shine. It was really more like, I know I have to be angry for her, right? Like, it's not just enough for her to be disappointed about what happened. Here's a girl that's literally trying to, on her own, right? Like, that's the other thing. These girls have to make these changes as 13 and 14-year-olds, you know? Like, it's hard for me to make changes, you know what I mean, in my late 30s. And so here's her sort of self-correcting, you know, trying to pull herself up out of whatever it is, and make changes, positive changes in her life. And here comes, you know, somebody to shut it down. And I'm like, and I saw the cycle being perpetuated. I'm like, we're gonna set her back. And this is what happens with these girls, you know what I mean? Particularly Black girls in school. Dr. Monique Morris writes about it, and I talk about her a lot in my book and reference a lot of her research. Georgetown Law did a study on it. I referenced that a lot. There's another study that's about Black girls pushed out and over-policed, underprotected. And a lot of these are in these, like, mainly school settings, you know? And here was an example where I was like, I've been reading about it, writing about it, and it's happening. And they don't even see it. The parents see it, and they think, oh, they're overreacting, you know? So I jumped in, and I told him, I was like, I'm jumping in the ring on this one because she's trying, and we're not going to push her back, you know, and have her revert. So obviously she was, I mean, the story was that she was able to run, you know. They wound up having like meetings with her parents and a few other people, whatever, but she had to sort of like prove herself, you know, sort of make a speech to the group and say, you know, why she wanted to run and how her behavior has changed and all of that. I don't know if all that was necessary per se, you know, but whatever, that's fine. I honestly think that it probably should have been done like before she declared or when they realized that she was. But I'm using that as an example because the righteous indignation just like rose up in me. I was so livid. Everybody was angry for her. And you just saw the community, the parents, the, you know, friends of the parents, whoever sort of come together and rally on her behalf. And I don't think she wound up getting it, but it was like a learning experience for her. That's what she wanted to try. She's on the honor roll now, you know. And so I use that as an example because what would happen if more of us were angry for these girls as opposed to trying to remedy their anger or fix their anger or make them happy, you know? She, I think, is able to find her own joy, you know, because the people around her were sort of sitting with her in solidarity and being God, you know, among, right, who's sort of suffering with, as opposed to, you know, trying to go in and make her change.
One of that story resonates so much with my own personal story. One of my kind of highlight moments in my own journey was seeing my parents. I had moved from a parochial school that was in Black Chicago and moved to a suburban school that was predominantly white. And it was interesting how in the parochial school I was the smart kid, but when I went to the predominantly white school I was the problem child. That narrative, particularly in my parents being angry, rising up against the school not wanting to give me access to some type of honor award because they said that I had problems or discipline problems, which was not true.
Right.
But there was their own assessment of my wit, charm, that I call charm, but
Yeah.
sass, all of that, that became a kind of sense of who my personhood or who I would be based upon those assessments. So I'm definitely in line with this who will speak, right? Who will also carry this anger. I'm thinking about the womanist paradigm, and particularly the discourse around womanism and how much of even Alice Walker's definition kind of brings us into conversation about Black women, but not as much dialogue about Black girls. I know the work of Dr. Evelyn Parker at SMU, who's done a number of works on Black girls, but just looking at how largely there needs to be much more engagement. And I'm thinking about, how do you see your work fitting into the kind of womanist discourse, or if you want to speak to that.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that I learned when I was writing the book was that there was no way to talk about Black girls without talking about Black women, right? Like, because, you know, my mom was reading the book and she's like, I was thinking about some of the stuff that I struggled with. It sort of works in concert, right? Like, so it's like, I get, or so I want to say, I don't understand how one can be spoken of without the other. I do get how we can deal with Black women in general. But a lot of our issues, or a lot of the things that that sort of manifest later in life, are things that happen earlier in life. So that is one thing that I learned. So I don't think I'll ever be able to continue talking about Black girls without linking it to who we are and who we have become as Black women, or who I am as a Black woman. But that was another reason why it was so important to put that theological piece in here. I mean, obviously that's my background, you know, so I think part of it is it was inevitable for it to come out. But then the other part is we need new narratives. We need new theological narratives. We need theological narratives, period. I don't even say new theological narratives for Black girls. We need actual theological narratives for Black girls, right? Positive ones, ones that, you know, that can be a part of the larger conversation in academics and, you know, outside in the church world. I don't see too much. There is some, like you said, but I don't see too much. And one of the things that I wanted to do is just start that conversation. I think that you know, there's semblances of it. I quote, she's not a theologian, but I quote Melissa Harris Perry's Sister Citizen a lot. And, you know, even in Sister Citizen, she's talking about Black women, but there are some things about Black girls in there. Like I said, I think they work in concert. And what I want to do with Parable of the Brown Girl is I just introduced, you know, just some new sort of thought in how we can center Black girls along with Black women. But then the other thing too, I think that's another essential component of womanist, well, not womanist theology, but womanism in general, is spirituality. And that was another thing too, you know, how, not necessarily religion, but how Black women, you know, connect to God. And I see these Black girls wrestling with spiritual questions, with God-type language, without necessarily even having that background, because a lot of the girls, or a lot of this generation, didn't necessarily grow up in church like, you know, I did, or you did, or whoever, you know, but they've starting to acquire this language, this sort of innate spirituality, you know, like, I wonder if God, or, you know, when they're sort of thinking about things, even if they're blaming God or angry, I think there's something to that. And so what I wanted to do was just introduce a new paradigm, or say, hey, we need to address this issue and this demographic, and this narrow demographic that the first publishing company had said to me. And so that's what I hope that it contributes to, sort of womanist scholarship in general, right? Just, I hope that it just becomes like a part of the conversation. You know, I don't think it's adding anything new per se. I think it's just introducing new characters, you know, that we should be paying attention to a little bit more, along with the adults.
So our final question that we ask everyone who comes through is, what does it mean to do the work your soul must have? That is a kind of womanist adage, and your interpretation of that in terms of your work.
Yeah. So I think personally that it means to do the work that you feel is meaningful, and that you feel called to do. I don't think calling should necessarily be just a sort of Christian language or, relegated to one particular religious perspective. I think calling essentially is just that. I see it physically, sort of the thing that you're drawn to do that give you meaning and purpose in the world, right? I think I had read somewhere a while that Dr. Cannon had said to a group of seminarians, before you make any decisions about life or relationships or career or whatever, do the work that your soul must do. And I mean, that is the advice of that, you know what I mean? If I have to go to my grave with that, in the sense of like, that is what I've been thinking of in every space that I find myself in, whether it's writing or if I'm at boarding school or preaching from a pulpit or whatever that might be. I have to stay true to what my soul is calling me to do. And if I don't, right, then there's a part of me that feels like I am not pleasing God, and so for me, that's why I've been so specific about Black girls, right? Like I don't care if it's a majority white space. I don't care if I'm in another country, you know what I mean? That's gonna be where my soul sort of draws me to. And that's going to be what makes me feel like I am contributing to God's kingdom, contributing to this world. And so that's essentially what it means to me.
So tell folks where they can follow you on Twitter or other spaces so that we can.
Folks there.
Yeah.
Okay. So you can follow me on Instagram. My Instagram name is @Khristi Adams. And you can follow me on Twitter @Khristi Lauren. That's my middle name. I'm not on Facebook, but Parable of the Brown Girls on Facebook. So you can follow, you can just look for the group page, Parable of the Brown Girls. That's it.
Thank you, Khristi,
Thank you
for joining us this morning. And it was such a pleasure to not only hear your story, but also to learn more about the book. And thank you for joining us again for the Just Womanist series. You can follow the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership at www.centerforwomanistleadership.org, or follow us on Facebook at Center for Womanist Leadership, or on Twitter @JustWomanist. Thank you. Bye.